I'll kind of start at the top level and then dive in. So this is WireMock Cloud. I have a list of mock APIs here. Mock APIs, you know, they in the cloud product, they have an internet address, and each one of these, you know, defines a unique API's behavior. And I'm going to go into my Open API demo. So this is a new sort of special type of mock API. So previously we've had a kind of generic sort where you can define a bunch of stubs. So stubs are WireMock's sort of request response format. Essentially, they're a recipe saying, you know, for a request that matches these criteria, then here's a recipe for the response. So previously we just had a kind of generic set of these, and you could define sort of pretty much any HTTP based API. But now we have a specifically sort of Open API backed mock API type, and this gives us this extra view here, which is an Open API document, and it starts off with just sort of header information. But I can toggle on, this is the developer portal part, essentially, that I can toggle on this public URL, this public documentation URL. And if I go and click this, we see some generated documentation. And again, it's not very interesting at the moment because, you know, we haven't defined any behavior yet. But as we'll see, it gets more interesting as we start defining an API. So in this mode, we generate bidirectionally. So we can start from scratch if we want, obviously, but we can also start with a pre-existing API. So if we've got an open API for an API that already exists, but we want to prototype new features on top of it that don't exist yet, then it will support that. And it will, if we change the open API, it will generate stubs. And if we change or add stubs, then it will generate stuff into the open API spec. So it allows us to supports this kind of evolution incrementally of your API design. So I'm going to give a brief demo of this. I'm going to demo a sort of simplistic, fictitious payments API, and I'm going to start with so let's assume that we're starting with a kind of a customer's endpoint in that API, which is already defined, and then we want to build a charges endpoint for getting and creating charges kind of on top of that. So I'm going to grab some YAML that I made earlier so that you don't have to watch me type it all out. So I'm adding essentially this single customer's endpoint in here that allows you to get a customer by ID, and it's got a couple of query parameters, a path parameter for the customer ID, and then a query parameter saying how much detail do I want. And then there's a schema and an example of a response. And actually we have a bit of a vendor extension we support here, which is the ability to pin kind of exactly the parameter values that we want for a particular stub, which can be quite handy if we want the request criteria to kind of match some exact values. Maybe if we're linking from some other system in and out of the mock, then being able to set these exactly can be really useful. So I'm going to hit save on here. And now if I go back to the stubs view, which was empty when we first came here, you can see now it's generated a couple of stubs, and it will actually, this probably deserves a bit of explanation. We generate a generic stub, which is just kind of a catch-all. It will match as long as the path template and the method are correct. But then we also generate a specific example, and that's based on that example that was at the bottom of the Open API. So we get the exact parameter values that we put into the Open API. So as you can see, this has got our method and path template. It's matching these parameters exactly to the ones we put in the Open API, and we get this example with a very simplistic bit of JSON in the response. And we can, as you see, we can open our test request maker here, and it actually helpfully pre-fills all of the parameters to the ones that this stub is expecting. So I can just hit send and make a request, and as we can see, we get the response back that we expected. If we hop over here now, we also have a generated documentation page now that there's stubs and Open API. So we can see parameter information, response schema information, all sorts of useful stuff. And we can make up to the parameter there. We can make an API request, which is making making a request to the mock API. So we have this sort of instant sandbox kind of effect behind this bit of documentation. So I've shown generation in one way. So this is our kind of baseline API. So what I now want to demonstrate is the process of kind of prototyping new features by going the other way, by creating new stubs. So let's say that we wanted to, first of all, add the ability to create a new charge. So we have a customer on file already, and we want to create a charge in a specific currency for a specific amount. So we might have that as a post, and so it's post to the charges collection, and then maybe we'll say there's a 201 response and everything's okay. We'll just say there's an empty JSON body for now. So probably we also want to come up with an example of what the body would look like. This will be a lot more useful than leaving it blank. So I'm going to say, in this instance, I'm going to make this quite a strict matching stub. So I'm going to say it's got to be equal to this exact bit of JSON that I'm going to use as an example. So this is really, like I was saying, when we're talking about kind of working in specific examples and sort of moving to moving to a more sort of generic model as we go, this is really what I mean. So starting with very concrete examples with exact values in, and over time we can evolve our mock and make it more generic, and likewise we can evolve our open API and we can make that sort of a model that sort of captures all of the constraints and requirements of the API. But initially we're going to start with an example. So we have an amount, we have a currency and a customer ID, and so at the moment this stub is requiring exactly this JSON in order to match. So I can hit save, and now if I head over to my open API, we'll see that there's this new charges endpoint that's been created, and it's inferred a schema from the example I gave, which is pretty helpful. Obviously, there are probably things that we would like to add to this schema over time. So we might add that this is a UUID format. But anyway, this gives us the kind of structure and the flesh of the schema. Creates an example as well based on the example we used in the mock. And then in doing that, we've also added it to our generated documentation. So you see very quickly we have this useful bit of documentation that can be shared with sort of other consuming teams. And while my team are kind of discussing and designing, we can add more endpoints. So we might want to get an existing charge by ID. Again, we can start with specific examples. So this time we might want to use charge ID as our path parameter, and we might want to give an example of what a charge ID looks like. Maybe it's a number rather than a UUID in this case for some reason. And again, I'm going to cheat and use one I made earlier, and we'll return a JSON response, something like that. And again, we're returning a specific response here, building up examples as we go. And again, we've generated the open API, we've generated the portal documentation, we've got the mock backing the documentation, so it's possible to interact with the API and try it out. And we can, but hopefully sort of fairly self-evidently, it's very easy to make changes to a mock like this. I can add and remove fields, rename them, restructure the data structures, all that kind of stuff. And this is far simpler than going off and writing the code that will produce the equivalent output. So it means that we can sit and interactively change designs around, and then when we're happy, we have this living document as the output of our design session. And as I mentioned before, consuming teams can go off and they can use this as a sort of essentially as a sandbox to start building against, and they can validate their client code against it in the API design. And likewise, the open API doc that we've generated can be used for code generation, can be used for validation, also gateway configuration, even if it's a kind of partnership kind of relationship, and all of this kind of useful downstream stuff. So that's about all I have to show in terms of the main demo.